Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today. I think we'll just give everybody a minute. There's some people coming in through the lobby, so we'll start at 2 minutes past, but bear with us while some people keep filtering in. Thank you. Cool. Okay. Well, I think we'll make a start. There's some people still trickling in, but we can let them join as we move through. So welcome and thank you all for attending today. My name is James Dennis. I'll be taking you through some bits and pieces today with my colleague Steve, who will introduce shortly. But really, the way we like to deliver these sessions is really around hopefully sharing some knowledge, some information, some lessons learned, hopefully in a relatively insightful and informal way. So please drop questions into the chat as we go. We'll endeavour to kind of answer them as we go, but there will obviously be a session at the end to capture them. But with that in mind, we are here today to talk about managing your Windows journey in 2022, looking at what that will mean for us regarding that kind of Windows lifecycle journey, the endpoint management evolution, and where that kind of tool set and process aligns for us to kind of make that happen, really. The agenda today, briefly, we'll be looking at what that strategy looks like, the blended approach of Windows and the tool sets around endpoint and modern endpoint management to make that happen, how we can inherently build security into this as a baseline, so we are, secure from the day dot and offset. What modern device management truly means, so whether it's config, Intune, Autopilot, what does that blend of tool sets look like? A quick refer back to what the Windows lifecycle management approach from PowerOn is, and then how that now blends into the interesting new world of modern VDI, which is obviously now blended across things like Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. So to kind of hopefully make this happen today, there's two speakers. So myself on the right, James Dennis, I'm the head of sales here at PowerOn. I'm ultimately responsible for our sales strategy, customer engagements and offerings. Really here today to hopefully just share some insights from the kind of customer perspective and how we're engaging with our industries and customers. But to kind of go into the tech and into the weeds a little bit more, I'm joined by my colleague Steve, who I will let introduce himself briefly.
Thank you very much, James. Good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Beaumont, as you can see on screen. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at PowerOn Platform. I'm responsible for looking at everything technology-wise from the desktop through to the data center and cloud.
Awesome, thanks, Steve. Great. So for those of you who are new to us or perhaps haven't worked with us in some of these areas before, I will just give a quick 5-minute rundown of who we are, what we do, and all that kind of good stuff. So we are, in the simplest statement, a managed service provider and consultancy provider for a range of organizations, basically looking to enhance their IT operations through the use of Microsoft technologies. That comes in a range of offerings across a managed service suite, which I'll touch on briefly, ad hoc consultancy through to transformational engagements, as well as flexible support services. We're based out of the UK head office in York, but we support a range of national, European and global customers, hopefully some of which are on the call today. And we have a range of customers on our own managed service platforms where we take care of that IT operations for them. We have a range of industry and Microsoft accreditations. So, some of the familiar badges from a Microsoft partner network perspective, but at the bottom there, some nice sort of newer accolades around things like the advanced specialization for Azure Virtual Desktop, which should hopefully be topical for today, as well as some of the EMS Elite work we've done around that kind of identity access management and security workflows that we support Microsoft with. So hopefully helping kind of provide that industry and technology reassurance. And on the right hand side, as this slide builds out, a quick snapshot of the kind of customers that we work with. Typically, PowerOn have engaged around the enterprise customer space with a pretty even split at the moment of both supporting the public sector and corporate enterprise customers. Hopefully some of you are on the call today as well on those badges, but For further details on kind of specific references and the bits and pieces, obviously feel free to reach out. And as previously mentioned, we are historically agnostic, but we perhaps with a preference, and that has historically been the Microsoft stack, but we have entered some really strong partnerships over the last 2 years with the likes of Fast Track Software and ArcServe to really round out our security, ransomware and backup offerings and workloads. So again, some strong partnerships and pieces in there as well. That's us in a nutshell, but beyond the tech, we obviously take things like our social responsibility very, very seriously. So that kind of has two main flavors at the moment. So we invest in our kind of communities, both externally and internally at PowerOn, in partnership with the charity Mind, who are a mental health charity in the UK. If you've not seen the stuff they've been doing, it's obviously been quite prevalent over the last few years with lockdown, home working, remote nature of our lives now. So we've been doing some great stuff, simple stuff is like fundraising and charity events, as well as obviously internal well-being and inclusion around that piece, which has, I think, been ever more important over the last few years. And on the right hand side, kind of that broader piece, the partnership with Ecology, who are a carbon offsetting agency who work across the world to plant trees on our behalf to offset our carbon footprint, which means PowerOn is fortunate enough now to be carbon negative, which means you get that kind of nice feeling if you jump on a train to London and back, that there is some sort of good happening elsewhere in the world to offset that emissions and other bits and pieces. That is a very mile-a-minute view of who we are, what we do and where we come from. Obviously happy to take more information and questions at the later half of the webinar around that. But with that, I will hand over to my colleague Steve to take us into today's topics.
Awesome, thank you very much, James. So I thought I'd start with just kind of talking around what is an organization's strategy when it comes to endpoint management. So if you attended our previous webinar around the journey to modern Windows in 2022, this might be a bit of a familiar slide, but it's really topical. So that idea of how you build out what your strategy looks like for modern desktop and its management side of it does start with what you're trying to achieve for your users and understanding the different use case scenarios, because it is not just a one size fits all situation. What we have been used to is just having that physical device. We would give them to users and they would generally work and we would manage them physical devices. There were other options. A lot of organizations had different scenarios where they'd deliver either thin client technologies with remote desktop services and Citrix environments. But especially in this situation, we're talking around much more of what the Microsoft offerings are, and that's where we start to introduce Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 into the mix. The biggest difference on this shift, especially with the Microsoft solutions, is not trying to look at how we fit server-based technologies and stuff, which we did previously to try and find a way of delivering service to a user, but looking at standardization on the Windows client operating system. So regardless of whether it's Windows 10 or Windows 11, we'll talk about evolutions to that later, but it's about how we deliver that client operating system to the users on the right types of devices. So be that a physical device, which we class as a Windows device, it runs one OS and they access it from that physical side, or the multi-operating system environments that we do invariably have, both internally within the organizations and externally in terms of partners, bring your own device situations, remote working, but looking at a secure mechanism as how we do the delivery platforms to gain access to our resources, depending on the type of user you are and what your requirements to access your corporate resources. There's lots of things that underpin how we deliver them. So looking at things like how we actually get the zero touch provisionings, how we build out these devices, what our update lifecycle processes are, the security controls that we apply on top of these, and also how we keep on top of what it is that we're deploying. And these are the types of areas I'm going to dive into, because these in essence make up our management platforms that specifically today around the Azure services, the Endpoint Manager and Defender for Endpoint, and how we bring these all together to actually help drive your desktop strategy of delivering services to users. Now, before we go into some of the main text and stuff, one thing that I did just want to kind of bring up as well within our strategy thinking side is what do we do around the Azure AD only joined capabilities that we have within Windows. Nothing new. It's been around since Windows 10 first came out, and it's a completely different approach than what most organizations were used to, which was joining them to our on-premises Active Directory, but having them much more in a cloud-only methodology. The main reason for this was starting to look at trying to reduce some of the reliance on legacy technology, taking it away from that on-premises Active Directory and gaining some of the specific security features that we might get with just having cloud-born devices, but also that massive ability to completely manage and work on them from anywhere without having that reliance on having to see domain controllers or potentially access resources on premises. Now that does lead on to the fact that we do still have things on premises, and working out what works, what doesn't work is not just a straight out the box, yeah, fine, we tick that option and everything just continues to work. There are obviously some things which will, and it's designed to work with them straight away. Things like accessing file shares, web services, are more than likely going to work. There's been enough development within this from the outset in terms of Kerberos authentication, so that users on cloud-only devices or Azure AD only devices will still be able to access them resources. However, some of the legacy applications will need testing, mainly if they're not built around some of the modern authentication protocols. They need to just be checked to see whether they will. Chances are they will. However, depending on just how old, you need to make sure and verify. However, we do know that there are some areas, especially if it is using machine-based authentication, because we're deliberately removing that aspect from on-premises, that they won't work. So it is a testing methodology. However, it's not to say that you can either just immediately jump or you shouldn't jump. It's about looking again where within the environment that there are standard pockets that this will work, so you can start to introduce it over time. And where you do have them things still on premises, it's looking at potentially other alternative presentation methods. Because one of the biggest drivers around this is to reduce reliance on virtual VPN connections back to your on premises, reducing that connection, reducing that footprint, and the reliance on having to have devices come back through on them legacy methods. So web apps, absolutely. Look at things like Azure AD App Proxy. How can we present them out externally? And again, gain benefits around some of the tech that we'll talk around with conditional access and MFA on top of your internal web-based applications. If it's legacy applications, what we class as Win32 apps, then again, mixing in things like AVD for publishing them applications out remotely might work as well for them. And then the biggest one that usually comes down to is around file shares. So organizations have obviously built up a lot of data over time. Necessarily doing a straight migration to something like SharePoint might not be applicable, but then certain areas like home drives, user profiles and stuff with OneDrive for Business is something that should absolutely be looked at to reduce the reliance on them. And then there's technologies like Azure Files and stuff that can help mitigate as well. And it's about going through that process and understanding to try and drive to where you can get to that Azure AD only and gain some of the benefits. Now, within Power On, we talk around several different focus areas we have as a business that drive the actual help for organizations and the focus of the applicability of the technologies and the designs for specifically modern endpoint. We talk around basically the 2 to 5 in this wheel. And then we have the 1 and 6 where we look at the overarching environment and how it interacts with both the desktop and the security and also the infrastructure side. And this is where we'll talk through for the rest of this webinar. So we'll start on the left on the Secure by Design and work our way round, and hopefully it'll all start to make a lot more sense. So, Secure by Design. So this is a principle that we take right from the outset of Power On when working with organizations to understand what the endpoint management and the endpoint design should look like. And we start by looking at how we can secure everything around, for instance, the identity piece, looking at how we do that march towards the zero trust identity piece, being able to look and consider things like how we secure at the front door people coming in, not just to devices, but your resources. Looking at conditional access, multi-factor authentication, taking a risk-based approach to what works best to both give you a high user productivity rate and not put blockers in front of them, but also securing these access to your resources. The lifecycle side is important because it's all right, well and good just deploying something once and having it out there, but how do we keep on top of it? How do we make sure that you're gaining both the quality updates that Microsoft release monthly? How do we make sure features are coming through in a reasonable time, but not just on the Microsoft side? We still have to be able to update and protect drivers, firmware, third-party applications. And that comes important when we look at the protection side as well. How do we actually know what's going on within the environment? What's causing us problems? How do we monitor, investigate them, and look at how we deal with them and keep the environment up to date and controlled so we know what exactly it is that we're looking at? Whereas the control side is much more that legacy side that people, or traditional side that people are used to, and how we actually put these controls and the aspects in place, both on our endpoints in terms of things like policies, what's allowed to run on devices, but more holistically, how we put in the processes and controls across the entire remit. So some of the technologies that make this up. So talking about the identity piece. So there's a lot of thought process that goes into controlling things now, especially as we're moving away from that isolated internal, you must be connected to gain access to it, to this work anywhere approach. And as a lot of organizations adopt more and more cloud-based applications, we need to have these controls at the front door, at the identity layer. So how do we best work around with conditional access policies that gives us the whole what and why and when people are accessing? So if we're only based in the UK, then only let connections in from the UK. If we're wider, how do we control that? Do we say that they can only come in on approved devices? Must they, and there's a high recommendation, prove their identity with things like multi-factor authentication? And there's lots of things in this space that keeps on developing. The recommendations change quite regularly. We've seen a big spike in attacks recently with a lot of people basically hammering away at multi-factor authentication and abusing the fact that users will get fed up with it at the end and just approve without actually knowing what they are. So how do we mitigate that? We look at the impact on it, introducing things like the whole, they must actually accept a number that's approved rather than just a straight yes or no approval, and how we help develop the understanding of that and the impact for your environments. Similarly, on the control side, policies, fairly well understood these days. You need to at least tailor what controls are on your devices, what the security aspects are, what do we enable, what do we turn off. But going deeper into, actually, there's a lot of fundamental technologies that Microsoft have baked into Windows 10 and 11 that a lot of organizations don't necessarily enable straight away because they're either not used to them or they're afraid of the impact. So we're talking things like attack surface reduction rules, little things that do make a difference but can have an impact. So trying to pick apart on where within the environment they can just be enabled, what level can we go to? Again, Microsoft themselves are recognizing a lot of the changes in the environment that should have been introduced probably earlier. Things like making sure that Word documents, if they have the mark of the internet on them, they disable macros now automatically, and they're driving these changes through. Similarly with attack surface reduction, looking at where we can put in these extra layers of controls that says, if we don't actually trust some documents, let's make sure they cannot spawn off and create child processes, etc. And then things like System Guard, where that's a much deeper layer of technologies, going right down to firmware level management or monitoring of the trusted chain, that again has just not generally been adopted in a lot of organizations right out of the box, because it takes a level of understanding and device capabilities to help implement that. But we can help understand and look at where we can secure them aspects. The big scary ones for a lot of organizations around app locker, Windows device application control, really securing down the devices to introduce only trusted applications to be run, are again things that we start to consider through the design and maybe not turn on for all, but again, phasing into the environment as you get comfortable with it. But again, these all link together. So a lot of this time that AppLocker and Defender application control stuff get either bypassed by giving admin rights to end users, just because it reduces the strain on the IT organization, because there isn't the building blocks in terms of deploying applications out there. But admin rights is something that absolutely needs to be mitigated and removed from environments. There shouldn't be a reasoning, even for the IT admins running with local admin rights. And there has been moves to a lot of organizations adopting things like LAPS, which is great, especially in that whole on-premises or hybrid Azure AD joined scenario, where you're preventing specifics around lateral movement and getting across from one compromised device to the next, to the next, to the next, because you had one single admin password and name on a box. To whereas in cloud situations, you don't necessarily have the access to things like LAPS, or LAPS is only a point in time if you want help desks to be able to easily access devices. So looking at other controls, maybe some of the cloud ones, which again has its own limitations that we need to dive into, but things like admin by request, which can help mitigate a lot of these while still not introducing a big blocker to user productivity. And this is where we mentioned earlier some of our partnerships, having the tools in our remit to be able to actually help organizations remove some of the blockers, but reducing that user productivity friction helps a great deal in understanding where these fit within our actual overarching design. Protection side, as I mentioned, yes, everyone is running antivirus, anti-malware, but then looking at that wider aspect, especially important these days for being able to understand vulnerability assessments, what the knock-on impact of our policy controls, our protection layer, that whole assumed breach, being able to dig into it and understand where, if something happens, it goes to, becomes ever more important to be able to actually understand what's going on within the environment, how we react to it, and how we close it down quicker and understand them gaps, which again leads back into that lifecycle management as we understand both the Microsoft estate and third parties, and now the firmware vulnerability, how that mixes in, what the impact and where the gaps are within our environment, and having that understanding to drive in a loop again back to our controls and our admin rights and stuff, and what extra policies we need to put in place to close them gaps, specifically around high value targets. So senior exec levels, admins, developers, where we need to make sure that they are functionally protected with extra layers of control. So taking that approach from the secure by design, understanding right from the outset and building up that roadmap to introduce all these concepts brings us round to how we start to do the modern device management side. So hopefully by now, a lot of organizations will have adopted a lot more of the cloud framework tools. So specifically in this case, the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Intune side. If you're not using Intune, great if you have another third party, hopefully similar, which gives you some of the benefits, tool sets. If not, if you're still just using Config Manager, I would say, why are you only using Config Manager? There is a lot of integration now between the traditional SCCM or Config Manager and the Intune side. And in fact, they are part of the same branding overall in terms of the Microsoft Endpoint Manager component or the product suite, which includes both. And simply adding tenant attach to your Config Manager environments gives you that flow of information from the on-premises Config Manager into the Intune side to give you access to some of the other bits and pieces that we're talking about and choose when's best to kind of shift workloads left and right. So if you are still using Config Manager and you want to gain some of the benefits that we talk about, and I'll show in a minute, absolutely, if you haven't already, major recommendation to start looking at giving the tenant attach feature its utmost importance of visibility now. Because when we get into the weeds of this and we start talking about the different types of devices, as I mentioned earlier in your strategy side, and bringing in the different delivery platforms, it makes much more sense to have a single tool to run them all. So the MEM Intune side of it is one of our key focuses for managing regardless. Doesn't matter whether it's physical or whether it's virtual, Windows 365 specifically should be treated exactly the same in terms of the management approach, the profiles, the controls that you apply to your physical laptops. While AVD still has a lot more focus around on the policy control side, so not trying to overdo it with things like software deployment, because there are some slight differences, which we'll go on to later. The biggest one for me is starting to do this shift between your legacy group policy objects towards configuration policies within Intune. There are tools that we'll talk around in a bit that can start to look at how you take that on-premises group policies and migrate to more of a modern world within the Intune side of it. But it's also about the KISS principle. Just because you've done it previously like that and since the days of Windows 7 doesn't mean you necessarily should take the same exact settings and apply them again from a cloud basis. There has to be a reasoning of why, what benefit does it give, and what security lockdowns does it provide that you need. And it's also that chance to actually start to look at stripping out some of that legacy debt. It's a lot easier to manage a few number of policies. This is kind of common sense at this point, than it is a ton of stuff that you've had for ages that people that implemented aren't there anymore. People have no awareness of why it's there. One thing that I will just hit on, and it's something that kind of sneaks under the radar a lot of the time, but it's a really useful feature within Intune, and that's around filtering. I was having a conversation internally actually around how we targeted something the other day, and that idea of just, oh, we deploy it to everything just in case, we capture it just in case. I was like, well, why? Let's actually do it down to a more granular level, and we'll tackle the stuff that we want to go and apply it to, rather than having to write extra scripts and stuff to kind of mitigate the devices that we don't want to get it onto. And I'll actually show that in a second. So let me drop to some of my consoles. So, talked a minute ago about the group policy analytics side. So this is my Microsoft Endpoint Manager console. You can see I've pulled in some of the baseline policy recommendations from Microsoft. So these are the actual group policy objects that would have been deployed internally, and I now get a bit of a visibility of just how much of this I can support within the actual Microsoft Cloud Stack. Now, you might go immediately and go, well, that's no good. There's only 28% of these settings that can actually apply to devices. Now, this is all about, again, that pragmatic approach. This gives you a level of visibility. It's not to say you can just go, right, we can't do it because it's not reaching 100%. You need to, again, still understand the exact settings that are being applied. So if I drill into this one, for example, you can see here it's got this setting that says allow Windows Workspace, and it's currently set to a no. Now, the good thing is on a lot of these other ones that are supported, it will give you the very direct, what Microsoft classes a CSP, so the configuration service provider, that you can go and tackle, you can find the information on and set. Whereas we've got this one that's a no, that's not actually a hard blocker. So Microsoft are always increasing what's available within the system. Sometimes there's some lags between what they do in terms of being able to do the analysis side of it and what is actually available. But it does mean that we get a very quick and easy way to be able to go and look granularly at the ones that can't and decide both A, are they applicable anymore? And B, can we actually still apply it? So if I go to my configuration profiles for here, for example, we do have a much newer system that had mitigated a lot of the problems we had before, whereas if there wasn't a specific CSP or Microsoft hadn't implemented it within the GUI, we now have the settings catalog where we're getting a lot of the compatibility of the comparison between on-premises capabilities as we do now have within the cloud. So if I go and search for ink, for example, scroll right down my list because I kept it very vague in terms of what it is, and we do actually have that same setting, which I can now actually apply. So the usual recommendation is to keep it on because users might want to use it, but disable it above the lock screen. So you can see very quickly that yes, we did some analysis. Yes, there was a gap. However, I had a targeted approach to be able to go and check to see whether I can still do it. And we now have things like settings catalog where we do actually have that capability to be able to go and configure that. So we have lots of bits and pieces within here now. So if you're not familiar with Intune, we have the whole configuration profiles. The good thing on this side is, unlike group policy, where we have to apply something and just hope it's applying, I can now a lot easier go in and actually look at these settings. And I know this is a bad one because this is one that I was recently looking at, but we get the discoverability feature that we don't have with the on-premises side. So I can now start to see exactly which devices, what settings, and more importantly, drill down and start to see exactly which devices are struggling to apply these settings in the first place, or dive even more deeper and start to see exactly which setting out of that did or didn't apply. Something that we never had with group policy without manually going onto devices, running reports, and having that interaction and time-consuming effort of trying to work out whether it was or wasn't working. So we have a lot of these newer capabilities that makes it a good, strong driver and reasoning for getting into using the configuration policies instead of the on-premises side. And again, the biggest one, doesn't matter where the device is. We don't have to worry about it having to contact on-premises, talk to group policy, talk to domain controllers and refresh it. The other flip side, as I mentioned, is around things like the filters side. So you can see that Smart 11 customizations that I had a minute ago, I was actually targeting at my all devices, but filtering it again down to just my all Windows 11. So it gives me the ability to say, fine, I don't want to have to manage lots of individual groups, maintain them, create dynamic groups, wait for them to refresh, have a time lag in there. Instead, I can ensure that I've got complete coverage. Hence, you can see that I've got non-applicable devices, and actually I'm targeting them down just to the Windows 11. So you can build up all sorts of filter sets to make your life easier. You can see here's some of the ones that we typically deploy that I have in there. Good example was you could have, say, a base group for your Surface devices, and then when you need that more granular, you might have a policy or an application, for example, where you could say, well, actually, I could deploy it to my all Surface devices group, but I'm going to then granularly filter and say this is actually only applicable to my Surface Go's. Similarly, as you saw with Windows 11, you might have a policy set that says, fine, this goes across all of my Windows devices, but I could exclude my Windows Virtual Desktop or my AVD group and have something that overrides and goes specifically to them. So filters, not often thought about, highly recommended just to be able to get that granular processing. Now, before I move into my next section of the webinar, which is specifically around the Windows Lifecycle Management, I thought I would also do a quick demo on that side as well. So it's great, again, being able to set and deploy out and do your controls and say it's going out there. But again, having that visibility becomes very important. And it's that continuous feedback loop of setting, apply, monitor. So we have controls within the actual cloud side system where we can take some of them data points from devices, having it processed in the cloud, and then actually be able to see what's going on. So Microsoft have this concept of update or upgrade analytics, which stores or pulls some of this data that Microsoft have in the back end around your devices and gives you some visibility into what's going on. You can drill down into this and see some of the log analytics queries. You can write your own because there's a certain language that applies across all this lot. Not sure why exactly that one didn't actually display. There we go. And you can start to break it down and see why some of these updates didn't apply. This one was successful, for example, when it was scanned. But that data set's all there. So you can very quickly, natively, out of the box, enable this to get some visibility. But like I say, because the data set's there, there's nothing to stop you actually drilling deeper into it. So there's some community dashboard reports that are out there. You can drag this into Power BI, and we've done this with some of our managed customers to give us a very granular view of it. But if you want to see exactly what's going on, trend analysis, it's hidden but available for you to dig into to get some rich insights into exactly what's going on, what your success rates are, and it's not just hidden away. And this is kind of mitigate where some organizations are used to having the WSUS approach or the config manager, used to that granular control where they can see exactly what's going on when updates are being deployed, but having to do that work and that effort of control. And when they start to pivot towards the cloud, they give up some of the control, let Microsoft systems work, but still want to gain that visibility and insight. So if I jump back into slide decks. So nice segue into the actual lifecycle management. Again, some of you might be familiar with this concept that we have within Power On of our process approach. So specifically on the feature update side, this is absolutely applicable. Having that idea that we still need to look at the data, so the inventory that's within the system, the reports that Microsoft have around things like Windows 11 compatibility, as you start to think about that going forwards. How do we prepare it? Have we got tool sets ready as we move into the actual, what we call the update rings? So there's a recommendation, again, trying to keep this as simple as possible. And it's quite easy to do around the test and the pilot phases. We choose a selection out of our environment that we want to do that initial 1, 2, non-critical devices, pilot phase, much more of a wider percentage within our environment, and then getting out into the full environment. But we still recommend doing it within phases. So thankfully, there are some stuff coming through on Microsoft to actually help us with more granularly doing the wave approach, but within a limited number of update rings. So something that's coming along through the pipelines is this Windows Update for Business deployment service. Now, this is not a new GUI or tool. We don't have to change what our approach is. This is about allowing Microsoft to do some of the analytics and the AI in the cloud based on your data and your telemetry. So it looks at actually taking a sample of devices, so breaking them down and going, right, I can see that you've got these 3 or 4 different hardware models or 20 different hardware models. I want a subset of them. Oh, these subset of devices also have a commonality of things like SAP installs, this line of business application, so I can break it down even further. It can then, within your, say, deployment phase, your main production phase, if you've got 2, 3, 5,000 devices, or whatever number you want to apply, it can intelligently slice and dice that and say, actually, I can see that this subset of devices, commonality between hardware, I want to create a nice spread of devices and put them much earlier in the process. So I can go and say, fine, if that wave works, and we don't see crashes on the applications, I can bring in quicker more devices that are similar to these and stage it out within that single ring, but without you having to do that analysis. Something that previously we did either manually, took best guesstimate approaches. We used tools like desktop analytics, which is now deprecated, and kind of had that visibility and could get suggestions for us to manually add them into it. This will now start to do that processing for you automatically in the cloud. Similar approach to what Microsoft did when they were pushing out for consumers, taking that subset and kind of ramping it up over time. We can now add that to our internal deployment for our organizations. It will also start to spot trends, and if it can then see that it's getting lots of crashes and stuff within there, it will start to automatically add holds and say, hang on, I'm seeing similar crashes, applications are getting graphics issues on these types of devices. I'm going to push them towards the end so that you have time to react and look at why that's going on, maybe push out updated applications. And it's all about trying to pilot as early as possible and analyze that to reduce your impact. The other thing that's coming across in the cloud side is a lot more control around the drivers and firmwares of devices that we've not previously had, of either just allowing Microsoft to push out whatever was the latest driver, which sometimes caused some great fun, moving back more into a bit more of an approval stage where you can push it out in a controlled fashion, as well as doing some of the firmware side. But none of this still mitigates the need to consider your wider estate. So looking at using things like Patch My PC for third-party patch management, because you still need to have that comprehensive cover, regardless of whether it's Microsoft or an Adobe product or a Java product. They still need to be considered. This goes back to that lifecycle strategy of how you look at your vulnerabilities and how you control and deploy them out. Now, there are certain reports, if I flick back to my consoles again, that can help you with this. And these are under the endpoint analytics side of it, as we start to look at things like the application reliability, again, about drawing these metrics out so you can see, you can react on them. Now, in this environment, it's mainly a Microsoft house, so I'm not going to do much to be able to resolve Microsoft Word being one of our most unreliable applications, but looking again, whether that's because we're not on the latest versions and so on, what our version spreads are, I can now start to dive into the metrics that I have to actually look at where I need to target my actual resources rather than just making guesstimates or assuming or looking at anecdotal help desk statistics. Similarly, with what devices are working well, we have a lot of this information to hand now that we can draw on. And I've always said data is king on how we make these decisions and how we use it to drive our decisions and our configurations and our approaches within our endpoint management. So moving on, that's some of the fundamentals. We've looked at how we consider what our approaches are going to be, what tool sets we're using, regardless of the environment. I keep on stressing this. What our update life cycle is going to be, how we control that in phased approaches, the speed we need to adopt it, especially important, especially in the UK with things like NCSC and the Cyber Essentials. There's a lot more focus on patching early, but from a management standpoint, making sure that we can patch early, but have mitigation and controls in place and the understanding of how. And then moving on to the different technology or the delivery platforms that we need to be able to introduce into our environment. And I get often asked, what is the main difference? What should I be using between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop? Now, for me, it's not necessarily a versus conversation. It's about looking at where the best fit solutions are for yourselves. And this comes down to what it is you want to use. If you're looking at a very quick, easy one-to-one mapping of giving a virtual desktop solution to an end user, then yes, that's where we might start to think around the Windows 365. The other good side is that Microsoft have this as a facilitated service. So you don't necessarily need to have much in terms of VDI specific skills. You basically treat them exactly as if they were Windows physical devices, and then look at using the same control mechanisms that you deploy down to them. However, if you want to have a bit more control over it, you're looking for density and cost control, and being able to scale it up and down, or you already have Citrix and RDS environments within your environment, then you might look at much more of the Azure Virtual Desktop side. Again, use case scenarios, you might want to go back to what we was talking about earlier around being able to move much more to either an Azure AD only join or have that bring your own device scenarios where you want to do much more of an app publishing, where you're just saying, here is the individual application rather than the full desktop. And this scenario fits that much more. IT is much more in control of the platform than say Microsoft. Microsoft provide a level, but you go much more deeper across into that side. But again, it comes at the trade-off of needing to have much more of a VDI or Azure skills. While that might sound specifically like there is kind of a versus there, one case scenario meets the other, it's not. It is about, again, understanding from your strategy perspective of what scenario you're trying to achieve and right sizing. You mix some of these in on this depending on what your function that you're trying to deploy and what your cost profile is. And again, if it depends on what your what your IT skills and experience are, this might be where you can say, well, actually, we can have a bigger cost saving by using something like Azure Virtual Desktop, but we don't have the skills, but offset it with something like PowerOn being the managed service provider that actually delivers your Azure Virtual Desktop, and you still gain the cost savings over something like Windows 365, but with the benefits and stuff that come on top of that, in terms of the flexibility, the scalability, and the cost control elements. So if I just drop very quickly, I am conscious of time, to give you an idea of this. So the M365 components live within Microsoft 365 or the Intune portal side. And you can see it just sits down here. I mentioned this previously, and there is a video that's on our Learning Hub that can do this, where in essence it's just a graphical controlled simplified interface where you basically say what networks you want to connect it to, what provisioning policies, so this basically says what OS that you're going to apply it to, and then you basically license it, and it will then provision an actual device for the end user to use, and that's about the level of control that we have within it. We set a very limited set of controls, what operating system, what network, and who's going to access it, and it's delivered. Great. Microsoft I can't say the word today, but they're hiding the back end in terms of the compute resources, what's going on, and you just target policies to them in exactly the same way. If I just dive into this object a little bit more, you can see that I have the very same sorts of configurations that I have applied to my desktop side of it, and it just works as a physical desktop. Whereas if I go and tackle something like the AAD infrastructure, you can see it's much more deeper in terms of the involvement within it. I'm within the Azure portal. You can see I have individual VMs and stuff that are spun up. There's disks involved, there's network connections, and then we have much more concepts around how we deliver the applications in terms of what it is that we want to be able to deliver, out to where and who. But that underlying infrastructure can be quite scary, for want of a better word, if you don't have the understanding behind it. And we talk much more around that idea of infrastructure as a code, using DevOps approaches and pipelines to be able to simplify the control and deployment. However, that does bring in that layer that we have complete flexibility, and we could say, unlike a Windows 365, which might be running 24/7, and you pay a flat fee for that, regardless of whether it's used for a minute or for 24 hours a day, the AVD side allows us to actually start to right-size the environments and say, fine, we actually only need to support 3 or 4 people on an evening or on a night time at 10 o'clock, so we can scale down the environment. This is where we start to use things like pipelines to introduce that automation control to say, turn off hosts when not needed. We might not need to have that VM running when it's midnight, when we only need to have 1 or 2 running, or we can ramp it up during peak periods, and we actually do it on a capacity-based understanding of what's best for us as an organization. So we have that control element. Like I say, takes skills, takes knowledge, and that's where us as a AVD specialist can absolutely assist with that. Get through that. So I hope that worked, or gave you enough information and some insights into the types of areas when it comes to managing endpoints within your environment, going through a modern transformation in 2022, blending in the aspects of the secure by design right from the outset, understanding the roadmap and where to bring in more control, but not blocking productivity across your estate, right from the identity layer through to the actual physical or virtual endpoints. There is a management tool set to rule them all with lots of different moving components, but again, one tool to rule them all, not to overdo the Lord of the Rings analogy, but then making sure that as it goes through, it's not a one-time exercise, and it loops back into your lifecycle management of consistently making sure it's updated, it's secure, new features as they're introduced are thought about and introduced at the right time with, again, cycling back to the controls. How do we adopt them? How do we improve them? And how do we make sure that we move to a much more modern stance of being able to deliver a platform to anywhere for the right type of user on the right type of methodology? Right now, I'll hand back to James and I'll take a look at some of the questions that have come through that I've not been able to keep an eye on while talking. But James.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so I appreciate that run through and glad to see that obviously the demo bits and pieces helped and worked today. But yeah, as Steve's alluded to, obviously there are a lot of moving parts and as ever with these things, the changing environment of Windows and the endpoint management presents a bit of a moving target at the moment. I quite like the Lord of the Rings analogy. One we used internally recently is, you know, the old world of config manager in Windows 7 used to be a bit like keeping your Tamagotchi alive. If you had one of them, feed and water it, and you know, most things were right in the world. And it's kind of moved a bit more into the world of, to quote my head of EUC, a bit more like the Power Rangers. The endpoint management stack has got lots of strong individuals, but if we pull them all together, we can form the Megazord, which is obviously a much more powerful way of tackling the ever-changing challenges of 11, 365 and AVD. So we're not quite the Power Rangers, but we are Power On. So how we're helping today is sharing a few resources that some of our customers have found useful. On screen, we've got some tactical workshops. So if you've not seen those yet, these are free 2-hour tactical tech workshops around Windows lifecycle management and modern endpoint management. And so if you want to kind of get that snapshot expert time with our consultants free, and that's a great place to start if you're not sure where these pieces might come together. If you want to get a bit under the hood of the Windows journey, we have a Windows 11 adoption assessment. So this is a 2-part workshop with actually potentially elements of it being funded by Microsoft if you're eligible, but that should help you understand the current state of play of device health and readiness for Windows 11, as well as some of the strategic and business requirements to jump to things like 365 and AVD and help map that out, which is fantastic. Obviously, if you're getting your teeth into these technologies and just need that little bit of help to get going, we have standardized POCs and pilots and deployment support paths that we can support with. So anything like that, more than happy to support. Or as Steve's alluded to, a lot of our customers are sick of trying to form the Megazord themselves. So, you know, why not give control to us and we can take the headache and operations of these moving parts away whilst empowering yourselves and your organizations to do what you've really been put on this earth to do is kind of drive your businesses forward in other areas. So that's a kind of flavor of where we can help in the different stages. And there should be some links dropping into the chat for the workshops, the assessments, and bits and pieces, but we'll include them in the follow-up. But if we jump to the next slide, there are 2 other nice free assets that we will share with you off the back of this call as well. So the 2 sides of the coin obviously are the Windows lifecycle and the endpoint management tools to make that happen. We have guides and frameworks to help shape and frame both of those things. So these have been around for a little while, but customers find these incredibly useful. So we will be sharing these as well. Great place to start, just to kind of get a feel for the different moving parts, recommendations, considerations. And again, if you want to look at these in a little bit more detail, please let us know. And then the last slide from me before we jump onto some questions is, you know, we have a lot of fun putting these sessions together and creating these pieces of content and assets and bits and pieces for you. But obviously we want them to be useful, relevant and impactful. So off the back of this session, we might be asking for a quick 90-second, 2-minute survey, because it'd be fantastic to hear, you know, do these formats work? Do the times, the topics, the content, the format? Is it working? Does it make sense? Do you want to see less of us, more of us? And obviously, more importantly, are there topics, technologies, issues that you're seeing and you want some guidance or thought leadership on? You know, please let us know. Be open, honest, and candid with the feedback where we can take it. But anything you can provide on that will help us provide hopefully some more beneficial sessions moving forward. And with that, we'll jump into some questions. Please drop them in the chat and we'll get through to them. If there's anything we can't answer today, we'll take offline. But I believe there are a few.
There are indeed. So first question was around the filter side again, and whether there's any specific filters or queries to show co-managed devices. There is. So quite a common one is filtering on the, there is what's known as a zero touch ID or ZTI, where you can then filter it, say it's this type of Autopilot device. And then there is the flags within Intune, whether it's managed by directly Config Manager, co-managed, or Intune, or even Office 365, heaven forbid. So you can probably just merge some of them together. The only problem is you cannot apply multiple filters to a device, so you have to think about how you layer it on. So you might have one which is a group of Autopilot devices, and then a filter for something like the code management side, or do it vice versa. But yes, you can filter on lots of different bits and pieces. Another question came through around, is there an easy way to get the CIS baselines into MEM? Probably. So some of the organizations, so I know NCSC specifically do, they actually publish like an export of their recommendations as a guideline that you can import into the system. Can't remember off the top of my head whether CIS do an exact same thing. If not, then you could basically import the group policy reports that they have into group policy analytics and then go through and kind of match them up. I know that obviously the CIS ones are quite robust, for want of a better word. So again, weighing up over whether you do want all of them, or whether you just want a subset. But most organizations now, like CIS, are giving in Intune specific guidance for that side. If not, group policy analytics is your friend. Can you configure a zero client thin client to connect directly to Windows 365 desktop or AVD? So I did just type my reply previously to this, but I will just caveat it. Not to Windows 365. So yes to AVD, absolutely. So certain providers have already got some bits out there, and specifically the iGel probably above and beyond the curve on this in terms of being able to actually integrate the device management side directly into AVD. The Windows 365 one, I don't know specifically if they've enabled that yet. In theory, there are some commonalities in terms of using the remote desktop client version, so possibly, but I'm not going to commit to 100% on that because it's usually driven much more from a web interface point and doesn't have the exact same level of control on that side. Somebody says, and they probably picked up on this message repeatedly, can you manage Windows 365 and AVD from Endpoint Manager? 100%. So like I say, the Windows 365, there should be no sort of difference in concept in your minds of how it's managed. Treat it like a physical device. Same policies, controls, all the rest of it. You might find some variations where you, for example, might not want to enable BitLocker with pins and stuff on Windows 365, just because the way it encrypts the disk and stuff differently, but you would still use the same tool, use the same company portal for pushing out applications, the same policy control sets. AVD, you can manage it in exactly the same way. I wouldn't personally recommend you do software deployment to AVD using Intune, mainly because it's a different concept on the underlying platform and how you build your images, and you do want to control it in a much more, in a multi-session world. This is more controlled fashion and using the Azure platform for building out your gold images, but do absolutely use it for pushing out your security policies and your baselines and gathering information stuff. So still managing it, just a little bit of a different consideration in terms of the complete level of control that you apply to AVD from Endpoint Manager, but Windows 365, absolutely the same. Obviously, there are various links and stuff in there. Would really appreciate it if you do go and specifically do the webinar survey form. Let us know what the feedback is on that and some upcoming topics that you'd be interested in, and check out the other resources and stuff that are there. Is there any more?
Yeah, there's two just come in, which are really good questions, actually. I've just published them, Steve.
Have a look. MS also provides managed desktop service that you did not mention. Is there any difference to your service offerings? Yes, absolutely. So the MMD from Microsoft. So Microsoft obviously want to be able to ensure that there is a definitive thing that they are in control of. and they narrow the scope down to basically being able to provide a standard set of policy controls that they don't massively like you changing on. So it's pretty much, you must have an Azure AD only joined device. You'll have that level of control applied to it that you can then discuss with them on alterations to it, and they will do your update management. But then everything else in terms of deploying software, all the rest of it is still your responsibility. Power on from managed services take a similar approach, but we add in a level of flexibility plus awareness that every organization is different, and we go right from the whole helping with the actually how devices are deployed with the autopilot side, what your configuration fits for your environment, and working with you to make sure that's the best fit and doesn't give as much impact. Still doing the update control, but helping you understand where applications are needed, helping you deploy applications, packaging applications, giving you that triaging element to be able to help you when there are problems that arrive, not on the end user side, but specifically extending the resources within your IT teams, becoming part of it. So we can actually help build upon that to actually make sure that the whole process runs through side to side, as well as giving you visibility and stuff back into it. Are you also familiar with the zero trust approach? We are. It's an interesting one, and it goes right across the board, and it's actually probably much more than what this webinar can fit in within it. Probably one, if you fill out this feedback form, and we can probably do an entirely separate one on that. But actually looking and understanding that every single device, this is a very high level summary, that every device is treated as if it is on a dirty network. So it's regardless of whether that device is sat within McDonald's or sat within your corporate network, what are the controls and mitigations that we apply on that, and what are the minimum level of access that they require, and who it is that's using it to what resources from within it, if I very high level summarize that without going into a full webinar on it.
Awesome, thanks, Steve. Well, I think that's all the questions that have been dropped into the chat. Obviously, if there's anything else, please do, catch them on the survey, respond to the email. If you jump to the next slide, there should be some additional contact information, I believe. But yeah, just wanted to thank everybody for their time today. Please check out the free resources, assessments, guides, workshops, and other bits and pieces that we've provided. If there are any additional topics to cover off in future sessions, do let us know. And if there is any kind of additional conversation needed on any of the questions, reach out to myself, the details on the screen, or anyone you know at PowerOn, and we'd be happy to help. But really appreciate everyone's time today. Only a couple of minutes over, which isn't too bad, but I'll let everyone run off and grab some lunch. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, all.